February 9th, 1964. Inside the Ed Sullivan Show studios in New York City, a hysteria unlike anything ever seen before was erupting. As four young men in sharp suits smiled and tuned their instruments, the screams of the audience shook the very walls. That night, 73 million Americans gathered around their televisions to witness a moment that would change history. They were the Beatles. But how did these four working-class boys from the war-weary, industrial, gray streets of Liverpool become the biggest, most influential, and most beloved band the world has ever known? This isn't just the story of a band. It's the story of a revolution that defined a generation. And, like all great stories, it begins humbly, with the fateful meeting of two teenagers. Our story starts in the late 1950s in Liverpool. As a port city, it was a gateway to the newest treasure from America, rock and roll. A rebellious teenager named John Lennon, burning with the fire of this new music, formed a skiffle group called the Quarrymen. And on July 6, 1957, while performing at a church fair, he met the 15-year-old boy who would change his life forever, a left-handed guitarist named Paul McCartney. When Paul flawlessly played 20 Flight Rock, John knew he had found his equal in wit, talent, and ambition. Soon after, they were joined by George Harrison, a younger boy who could make his guitar sing. But the place that truly forged the Beatles was not Liverpool. It was the grimy, smoke-filled clubs of Hamburg, Germany. When they arrived in 1960, they were just kids. In clubs like the Indra and the Kaiserkeller, they performed for 8 hours a night, 7 days a week. They took amphetamines to endure the brutal schedule and slept in cramped, squalid rooms. But this trial by fire transformed them from just another band into a relentless rock and roll machine. They learned hundreds of songs and mastered their stage presence. When they returned to Liverpool, they were no longer amateurs. On the stage of the city's underground venue, the Cavern Club, they possessed an irresistible energy. It was in this damp, sweat-drenched club that they met the man who would see their true potential, Brian Epstein. The owner of a record store, Epstein saw in these leather-clad youths something even they couldn't see in themselves. He became their manager, cleaned up their image, put them in suits, and turned their raw talent into a product the world was ready for. The final piece of the puzzle was the drums. After dismissing Pete Best, the cheerful and steady rhythm of Ringo Starr completed the lineup. The Fab Four was born. With Brian Epstein's vision and producer George Martin's musical genius, the rise of the Beatles was meteoric. By 1963, they had conquered Britain with hits that exploded with joy. A simple, three-word phrase became a national anthem. She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. Everywhere they went, there were screaming crowds. Beatlemania had begun. But the real prize lay across the ocean. America. And on that night, February 9, 1964, when they appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, they conquered it. They brought a wave of joy and energy to a nation still mourning the assassination of President Kennedy. Within weeks, the top 5 spots on the American singles chart were all held by Beatles songs, a feat never repeated. What made them so special? It wasn't just the music, but their personalities. John, the witty leader, Paul, the charming genius, George, the quiet guitarist, and Ringo, the lovable drummer. There was a Beatle for everyone. Their early music was an offering of simple, irresistible truths, a joyous promise shouted in perfect harmony that I wanna hold your hand. With films like A Hard Day's Night, they brought their cheerful world to the cinema. In just 2 years, 4 boys from Liverpool had become the most famous people on the planet. By 1966, being at the center of the storm was exhausting. At their concerts, they couldn't even hear themselves play over the deafening screams. After their final concert at Candlestick Park in San Francisco, they made a historic decision. They would stop touring. Many thought it was the beginning of the end. In reality, it was the beginning of the real revolution. Retreating to the studio, the Beatles began to push the boundaries of music. Influenced by Bob Dylan, they wrote deeper, more personal lyrics. As they sang, "There are places I'll remember. All my life, though some have changed," it was clear the simple love songs were a thing of the past. George Harrison's interest in India brought the sound of the sitar into Western pop. With the albums Rubber Soul and especially Revolver, they proved that pop music could be art. Backwards tapes, studio effects, unconventional instruments. The studio had become their playground. And then, in 1967, came the album that changed popular music forever. An Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It wasn't just a collection of songs, but one of the first concept albums. It was an explosion of music, art, and psychedelic culture. The Beatles used the studio as an instrument, creating sounds no one had ever imagined, inviting listeners to picture yourself in a boat on a river with tangerine trees and marmalade skies. Sgt. Pepper became the anthem of the Summer of Love and transformed the Beatles from a pop group into the most innovative artists of their time. But a tragedy that followed this creative peak would shake the band's foundation. The sudden death of their manager and father figure, Brian Epstein, left them without an anchor. The cracks began to show. After Epstein's death, tensions grew. Their 1968 double LP, The White Album, was the clearest evidence of this fragmentation. It sounded less like a group effort and more like 4 solo artists. John, influenced by his relationship with Yoko Ono, moved toward more experimental work. Paul continued to perfect the classic pop melody. And George, with Songs of Aching Beauty, was finally proving himself to be one of the group's strongest songwriters. You could hear the melancholy in his notes, an anthem for their internal struggles. While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Their final 2 albums tell the story of their farewell. Abbey Road was a polished and elegant final salute, a last brilliant flash of the group's musical genius. The Let It Be project, however, began as an attempt to get back to their roots, but instead documented their disintegration. As part of this, on January 30, 1969, they climbed to the rooftop of their Apple headquarters and gave one last, unannounced concert. It would be their final public performance, a bittersweet echo of their early energy, pleading to the world and to each other to get back to where you once belonged. The end was now inevitable. Musical differences, business arguments, and personal frictions had destroyed the magic. In April 1970, Paul McCartney announced his departure, officially ending the legend. When the Beatles broke up, they left behind more than just a collection of immortal songs. They had rewritten the rules of popular music. They were among the first to write their own songs. They revolutionized studio technology, and they proved that a pop group could be true and important artists. Their story was an incredible journey that began in the basements of Liverpool, rose to the screaming heights of global stages, and found its ultimate expression in the quiet genius of the recording studio. They were 4 friends, a phenomenon, and a revolution. Their music remains as fresh and timeless today as it was then. They didn't just belong to an era, they belong to all time. And in the story of their music, they left us with one final, profound truth. And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into music history, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one.